Hey gang, Joshua Bacarella here with Sportsmen's Direct. We're going to change it up a little bit and do a quick video on live bait rigging techniques. You guys come into the shop all the time, and I take for granted that you know all these different little tricks or different ways to hook different baits onto the hook. And so I just thought I'd take a few minutes here and explain a few of those things that I take for granted when I'm out there. So we'll start out by, we're going to talk a little bit about spikes first of all. And for those that don't know what spikes are, spikes, we refer to them as spikes, call them Eurolarva, I don't know what other names they have for them, but basically they're maggots, okay? These are basically, you know, fly larvae. They're literally maggots. Now they're fed all these different colored foods, I guess, to make them change color. So they come in, you know, once upon a time when I started fishing, they came in white. That was it. You had white spikes. That was all you could get. But now you can get all different kinds of colors: red, yellow, blue, pink, orange, all different variations. And so I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to rig. Now, if you look at these little guys really close, if I can get him to move around, he's probably going to get him to move around in there for sure, because I haven't touched them. But spikes actually have two ends. They've got a blunt end. Let me get one that's more active here, if I can get one more active. They calm down after you grab them. They kind of freak out a little bit and they tighten up. So that guy is moving there. Now, the blunt end is the head, and there's actually two little eyeballs if you look at them real close, believe it or not. And then you've got the pointy end, which is the tail. So they kind of move backwards just like a nightcrawler will a lot of times, right? Now, cool little thing about spikes, a little, I guess some trivia information is, spikes are one of the cleanest insects. They actually produce ammonia, and that's what allows them to, I guess, go through and decaying animal tissue and, you know, and not get sick, I guess is a way to look at it. They don't pick up any of that bacteria. It all gets killed on skin contact. So enough of the trivia. So what I want to call your attention to is that little end there with the two little eyeballs. That's normally where I hook my spikes. At least that's one of the ways I hook the spikes. Is I will take, and it's got to be a nice sharp jig. This is a little 4mm epoxy tungsten of ours from our heavy metal series. And probably the most common way is to just barely pierce the skin like so. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm just kind of pierced right back there lightly through the skin on the eye side of the spike. And you see he's still moving around pretty good. He's squirming. I know the animal rights people are going to freak out right now because I just impaled a living organism on a hook. I'm sorry, but I'm going to catch a fish and hopefully impale something bigger when I drop it down there in the water. Now, so this is hooking one spike on. I almost never ever start out fishing with one spike. I'm going to try not to hook myself here on all these extra hooks. Generally for me, especially on like a 4mm jig like this one I have here, I am usually going to start out with 2, maybe 3 spikes. And for me, I like to mix it up a little bit, and I'll usually put 2 whites and a red on. It's kind of my go-to starting. So I'm going to grab a red one here. We're going to hook him on basically the same way, just like that Gensworm got hooked on my shirt. So if I hook that little guy on there next, and then we're going to finish him off with a white. Again, that's all on that blunt end, right there by on the eyes. That's the first rigging technique I'm going to show you. Now, here's something else you want to think about. And it's kind of like for you guys that are bass fishermen and fish a lot of plastics, you know that the more plastic you have on your bait, you can change the fall rate, right? And those fish will respond differently depending on how fast that bait is falling. The same thing can be the case when you're ice fishing. So the more meat that you add to this bait, you will change the fall rate and you'll change the action of the bait. Even when you're jigging, the more bait that you have on there, you'll actually change the cadence of that bait. You'll change how it swims, you'll change how it falls. You just change it. So, you know, you don't have to settle for 1 spike, 2 spikes, or 3 spikes. You can load this baby up. And sometimes, like if I'm fishing crappies and they really want it falling slow, you can load this thing up with 5 or 6 or even more spikes on there. Now, one thing you do want to be conscious of, and you can check this after you put the bait on and you drop it down in the hole, is give it a couple of quick jigs right in the hole before you drop it down and see how that bait is responding. If that bait is spinning every time you jig your line, you may want to adjust those spikes a little bit just so that that bait doesn't spin so violently. So that's your basic spike rigging technique right there. And so that was the basic way to rig a spike. Now, on those days when the fish are really short striking, and you guys know what I'm talking about, right? You get a little nip, and the fish is not committing. They may come up and they may grab the tail of the spike. They're just going to grab it, and sometimes they'll swim off with it. You know, one of the tricks when they do that, if they grab it and they swim off with it, especially if you're sight fishing and you can see that they don't have the hook in their mouth, if you drop them a little bit of slack, they'll suck it in. That's just a little tidbit. But one of the other ways to get them to commit is to not give them anything to grab. So I'm going to do this with a red spike. And again, you want to have a good sharp hook in order to do this. But instead of just nipping it through the skin on that head end, what we're going to do this time is we're going to impale that spike all the way on. And you definitely got to have a good sharp hook to do this. Otherwise, the spike will just kind of stretch and turn inside out on you. And you want to, and it's kind of messy, honestly, but that's kind of the idea. And you can do it with more than 1 spike. So in this case, it's just a little hunk of meat, so he's just kind of impaled on the hook. It's not real doesn't look real tantalizing to us. I know it's just kind of a mush pile of you know, bug meat there. You can do the same thing. I can grab another white one. I can change the color on it, and I can impale a second one on here. Kind of pierce the skin and then kind of thread them up on there. And actually, you want to kind of squish them a little bit. You want to get a kind of a mess there. Now, when a fish comes in, if he wants to eat, he's going to have to grab the hook. There's no way around it. He can't taste it. He can't pluck it. He can't pull on the tail. So on the days like a cold front like we got out there right now, and it's just miserable cold out there, that fish is going to be forced to come in and take that hook in. He can't grab these spikes by the tail and pluck them off or swim away with them or anything else. If he's going to grab it, he's going to get the hook. So on a cold front, when the fish are biting really light, that's one of the secrets to getting them to bite. And you can catch a ton of fish on a spike or two like this because they can't pull them off. So it actually in the water, I'm going to gush it up here a little bit. After every fish, it actually gets more and more tantalizing. All right, next thing I'm going to talk about here is waxworms. Now, waxworms are a much bigger critter. I'm going to dig in here in the sawdust. I'm going to get a candidate or two. You're going to see all different size ranges on waxies. Some great big, beautiful, fat jumbo ones, which that one's kind of just a small to medium dude, and they vary. I'll get a couple of them out here. I just grabbed this off the floor. Somebody might have already picked through it for the big ones when we were packing them out. I was hoping to get a great big one to show you one of these techniques. So again, waxies are a moth larva, a lot bigger than a spike. I like to use them especially for crappies and for bluegills. The spikes are really like for perch. I'm going to use the same hook here, just a 4mm epoxy tungsten. And I'm going to show you one of the techniques. And that's, I'm going to start out with what we call T-boning. And T-boning is basically hooking that spike right in the middle. And it's a lot like what you guys would do when you're wacky rigging, right? So when you're wacky rigging a worm for bass, you're going to hook them in the middle. And then when you shake him down there in the water, he kind of kicks, both ends of the tails kick. So that's, you know, that's wacky rigging. Don't do it real often that way, but sometimes, you know, the fish will tell you that's the way they want it. So that's the way you give it to them if that's the way they want it. Especially when you're sight fishing, you can see their reaction to all that. I'm going to use the same guy here, and I'm going to rig him kind of like I normally would, and that's going to be to thread them on, which is pretty basic, right? Threading a waxy on. When they're small like this guy, if I had a slightly bigger jig, I can thread more on there. But, you know, I'm going to go a different route. So that's your basic threading. You can even flatten them out a little bit. Again, you animal rights activists are going to freak out on me, I know. This works really good when you got dead waxies, if they're, this guy's not flattening real good. But if you flatten them out, and then just kind of hook them lightly up by the head, that guy will really kick and flip when he's in the water. And he's still alive too, so you still got some movement out of him that way, but you can really mush them right down and flatten them right out so they look just like a little piece of skin kind of kicking there. So that's another way to rig waxies. And I'm going to try something here, and I'm not sure if it's going to work with this guy because he's not real big. What I just did is I just pinched his head off. You can do that with any of these baits, guys. You can pinch them off, break them open, get scent in the water. I'm going to use a hook here if I can. I'm going to try to turn this guy inside out. Yep, that's right. I said inside out. I'm just going to try to flip him. And this hook might be too sharp to do it. Because the idea, actually I'll use the actual hook. Sometimes you can do it with a toothpick. Sometimes you can do it on the hook that you're actually fishing. It kind of just depends. It kind of depends on the size of the waxy. So I turned that waxy inside out, and what that does is it exposes, you know how they got all the little tiny legs, right, that they move and they can crawl along with? Well, every one of those tiny legs has got a little connective, like a ligament. It almost looks, it's like a cartilage kind of material. So once you turn them inside out, you've exposed all those little legs of cartilage. And when we drop him in the tank, you're going to see that it looks kind of crazy because it's going to be all fuzzy and milky with all the, you know, all the scent coming off of it, and you're going to have all those little legs exposed, which for really, really finicky fish can just be something they're not used to seeing. So it's going to trigger bites for you. But it's kind of a pain in the neck to do, as you can see me doing it here, even in warm conditions here inside the store, compared to doing it out there on the ice or in a shanty. It's a lot harder to do. But hey, you know, if you're trying to get that big fish to commit, sometimes you got to do what you got to do, right? So we did the basic, what we call dry bait rigging, right? I mean, you can use night crawlers and other things too, guys, just like in mealworms and all kinds of other kinds of dry, buggy critters. I mean, they're all going to be the same. You can do the same sorts of things with them. You can T-bone them, you can hook them on the end, you can pack them on there. The more the merrier. Let the fish tell you what they want. You know, use the volume of bait to control your action of your lure as far as the descent, and also try to pay attention to whether or not that jig is spinning, and adjust your bait accordingly. If it's spinning too much, you know, kind of rearrange that bait a little bit on there so that your jig doesn't spin as you jig it. So what I've got here, and this is kind of a local favorite, and this is a wiggler, or a mayfly larva, Hexagania limbata, I believe, and if there's an entomologist out there, maybe they'll correct me on my pronunciation, but you know, these guys are kind of creepy looking. They're much creepier looking in their nymph phase like this compared to the adult phase with the wings and everything on it. They're kind of cool. But so they got little claws on them. They crawl around down in the mud and the mucky bottoms, and fish love these little guys. And they are all over the country, and I don't know if you can get them all over the country for bait, but we get them here, and they're kind of a delicacy. This is another bait that is known for making cold front fish really bite. And they really just cannot pass up a fresh wiggler. Whether he's live, preserved, dead, it doesn't really matter. They will eat a wiggler when they will eat nothing else. So I'm going to show you my favorite way to rig a wiggler. And so they've got a carapace, which is like a little shell right on their back, okay? Part of their thorax up in the middle of the body. And the way that I like to rig them is I like to rig them from the back towards the front, ever so lightly. You see his tail stick out, because see his little three-pronged tail stick out when I did that, because he really did not like me sticking that hook through him, and neither would you. But so I've got him hooked on there now. And the reason why I hook them that way, for me, mentally, is I generally think that fish can identify with those eyeballs and they can see the front of the bait. So if that fish can take him head first, he's going to be a little less reluctant to take the bait. Takes a little more time to hook them that way, but I think your hookup percentage will go up by hooking them that direction, because when that fish comes in, he's going to go for the head and he's going to get the hook. So a lot of times these are one fish wonder baits. You're going to get one fish on a hit because they're very soft, and it can be, you know, hard to keep that bait intact going from fish to fish. But if you can get more than one fish on them. Don't be afraid to just fish the tail. If that's all you're left with, drop it down there. These baits are about as natural as they come, and you know, like I said, fantastic for getting really tight-mouthed fish to bite. Now, when I was in New York, they have a what I would call a much larger version of this called an okie, and the okies are quite a bit bigger than our mayfly larva, and I'm not sure what they, what they're a nymph of, but they use those out there, and they catch a lot of fish on those as well. Hellgrammites is another one. I don't like hellgrammites. They're nasty. They bite pretty hard. We try to fish them out of our mayflies when they come in. We actually had a couple mixed in there today that we pulled out before we started packing these guys out. But all those little aquatic invertebrates you can use for bait, and they will all catch fish given different conditions. So that's pretty much the only way I hook the mayfly larva. If I get really, I guess if I'm lazy, I won't pay attention to whether I'm hooking them forward or backward, and I'll just hook them on there and get them back down the hole fast. But I don't fish live bait a lot, so, but on a cold front, mayfly larvae are fantastic. Next wet bait we're going to talk about is probably the one that you guys are most familiar with, and that's minnows. And yes, there is more than one way to hook a minnow. There are actually a multitude of ways to hook and rig a minnow, and I'm going to show you a couple of those right now. I'm going to get a couple of candidates up here. So I'm going to change hooks on you here real quick, and that tungsten jig I had, that was what I would call a horizontal jig. Okay, it's gonna lay horizontal to the earth, and we're gonna switch over and go to a vertical type jig really quick here. So, and this is just a generic, lead jig, vertical style, meaning it's going to hang up and down as opposed to horizontal. And we're going to start out hooking our minnows with that guy first. I'm going to grab a little customer here. Got some wet hands, and we're going to try to do this without having him escape. And I would think that most of you out there this is probably going to be the most common way that you're going to rig a minnow, and that is lightly hook them in the back as lightly as you can. And I like to do it right in front of the dorsal fin. Okay? And for me, the reason I hook them in front of the dorsal fin is I'm trying to get close to the head, because again, most of the time fish are going to come in, are going to take them head first. And so that gives you the, if you hook them too far in the back, you have to wait too long to set the hook. If they don't take the bait in all the way, they can run around with it and not have the hook in their mouth. So if you hook them all the way forward like that, it's more likely that that hook's going to go in as soon as that fish takes the bait. So that is the hooking just in front of the dorsal fin technique. We're going to take this guy now, and I'm going to pop that hook out, and I'm going to show you probably the second most common way. And this next way, you don't necessarily have to have this horizontal or this vertical type jig. This next way you can do it with vertical or horizontal. So this next technique is real simple, and that is hooking them through the lips. This will also keep your bait alive a long time. Now, if I'm going to hook them through the lips and I'm going to use this vertical type jig, I'm going to be fishing it actively. I'm generally going to be fishing it up and down with a steady jigging motion. I'm not going to dead stick him like this. If I'm going to dead stick him most of the time with a vertical bait like this, or if I'm going to dead stick a minnow, I'm not going to use a vertical one like this. I'm going to use a horizontal jig of some sort. Like, I'm going to throw a kind of an old classic out here to my friend Dave Gens. This is a Gens bug, or Gens worm, I guess. I guess it's a Gens worm. So that's just through the lips with a horizontal bait. I could have done it with the tungsten jig, although generally for minnows I'm going to use a little bigger hook gap than what I would find on most tungsten jigs. Other than like our 6 mil that we make, we put an oversized hook on that 6 mil epoxy pro, and that works out really good for minnows. The next technique is going to be again with this horizontal, and this is a little bit on the small side for the hook on this guy, but we call this a skull hook technique. And this one is really not live bait, because we are going to hook that minnow right up through the skull. Now, the advantage to hooking them through the skull is that he can't get ripped off. I mean, unless you get something that's going to come up and rip that minnow and cut the minnow off of the jig, he's not going anywhere. So when you get those days that the fish are really hammering minnows and they really want minnows, but you're losing minnows to fish because they're plucking them off, whether you're hooking them in the back or you're hooking them in the lips, those fish really don't care if that minnow's alive, and neither should you. So take them and just hook them right through the mouth and right up through the skull. That's going to give you the strongest connection to that bait fish that you can get, and the most natural presentation. This isn't just for panfish. Same thing for walleye, lake trout, northern pike. If you want to skull hook a smelt, I mean, it doesn't matter, but when those fish are actively feeding and you want to make sure that that bait stays on there, that's when you use the skull hook technique. Now, if we're talking bigger baits like walleye baits and you're talking bigger shiners, you can also skull hook them and then add a stinger hook on top of that and put that stinger further back. So that's just another technique for live bait. That's the skull hooking technique. And again, that's going to be on your horizontal presentation, generally with a big enough hook gap that you're going to have enough hook sticking up out of that bait fish so that you can set the hook on the fish, you know, and effectively impale him. Let's see. I'm going to get another lively candidate here, maybe a littler guy. Now this next technique you can do with just a single hook, or you can do with, prefer to use something relatively lightweight, because kind of the idea here is we're going to tail hook this guy. This is probably my least favorite way to hook live bait, because it's not super easy necessarily to get it through without sticking yourself in the finger. But by tail hooking them, you're allowing that bait fish to really struggle. He's going to stay alive. He's going to kick. He's going to take off. He's going to dart, especially on a single hook rig, maybe with a split shot up above him. And he's going to constantly dart and dart and dart and dart. And if the fish are really turned off, sometimes it's not the best way, because they might get tired of trying to chase if they're looking for an easy meal. But there's other times when tail hooking works really well. And like I said, you don't need to have a hook with any amount of weight on it whatsoever. There's another, this is kind of an unusual technique here. It's along the lines of having that fish struggle and try to take off. This is called a drop gap jig. Very similar to like a wacky hook as far as the shape and orientation. And this one isn't as much a rigging technique as it is just an overall presentation. But if the fish are really turned off, we'll take this jig and literally drop it down to the bottom. Let the jig itself anchor the minnow to the bottom, and then that minnow is just going to kick and pull and kick and pull, and he's going to try to get away, but he's going to be on that hook, and to the fish maybe he looks like he's bottom feeding or something or struggling, but the reality is that minnow is, he's trying to get away from that hook. He's trying to move. He might drag that jig around a little bit on the bottom, which just adds more to the overall presentation. But this is a drop gap jig, and like I said, you could use the similar philosophy by using any relatively heavy jig and anchoring them down to the bottom to try to escape, basically. Well, I think that's all I've got for you at this point for live bait rigging. So I hope you can see that there's multiple ways. If somebody says they're using minnows, maybe there's a couple more questions you might want to ask besides how deep and where. You might want to ask exactly how were they rigging. Same thing goes with the spikes and the waxworms, right? So it kind of changes the whole perception of when you ask somebody a question about were you catching them on spikes, were you catching them on waxies, wigglers, minnows. And you also got different types of minnows too, right? You got fatheads and emerald shiners and all that, but we're not going to get into that because the same rules apply to all those different species of bait. It's just how you rig it. So how you rig it does matter, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks for joining us.